Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. And I'm so excited to have my next guest here to share his stories of walking through masculinity. Alec Mckee describes himself as a leader, an artist, and a lover. He finds himself in a phase of life, due to his upcoming graduation from college, where he has to answer many of the questions of what it means to transition from a young man to a man. Alec and I worked together in the past within my coaching work, and many of our conversations surrounded the exploration of what it means to be a man. I'm so excited to have him join me as we both deepen our relationship to the new masculine. Welcome, Alec. How else would you like to introduce yourself and to our listeners of this podcast?
Hello, Travis. Thank you for having me. It's a nice introduction. I'd like to say I am, as you described, an artist. I'd say the ways that I express that are through music, specifically songwriting. So I play guitar and sing some songs, and I really love to take photographs too. And creating images is something that I find to be really special. Like you said, I'll be graduating here in December from college. I'm a psychology major at the University of Minnesota, and I've been really excited to be studying psychology, and I'm excited to transition into a new phase of life here in December.
Yeah, I'm super excited about your sort of knowledge and learning around psychology, because I think psychology plays a huge role in the conversation we're having here on this podcast around masculinity. I think that the ways we've been trained, the ways that we create our identities, the ways that we are afraid, the ways that we fear rejection or loss of love or abandonment, I think those are all things that are both in the language of psychology, but then also within this concept of deconstructing masculinity and reconstructing something new. I'm really curious to know, for you, what it means to be masculine.
That's a good question, and I think it's something I struggle with a little bit, just in terms of what the word itself, masculine, means. And so, even prior to this podcast, I was kind of just Googling, like, what does the word masculinity even mean? And it looked like it's kind of describing sort of general trends of people that identify as male, and so sort of like a generalized norms. And so I think for me, at this point in my life, I have a certain set of like what I see as sort of what it means to be masculine, and that's changed throughout my life. But at this point, I think it's a broad array of traits.
I think the listeners would be really interested to hear sort of that shift that's gone on from you. Sort of like, what were you taught growing up, and what were your sort of ideals of masculinity back then, and how have they evolved? How have they changed for you?
Yeah, so I think, of course, as many of us experience when we're younger, we get really sort of exaggerated pictures of masculinity and manliness. And I like, to me, what kind of sums up my sort of what I thought as manly when I was younger is like the sort of Sylvester Stallone type character. So I think when I was younger, it was someone who was really muscly, had a really low voice, kind of was short, had short hair. I think someone that was really confident, sometimes violent, but also someone that was assertive and self-assured. Um, I think it was someone too that was very sort of adept at navigating girls, interacting with girls, and relationships, or someone that was just like really confident with girls. Um, and I think that's changed, and some of those sort of traits I now know are just a little exaggerated. I mean, to me nowadays, I don't quite see the sort of muscly, bristling, kind of egotistical male as someone that's masculine. But I still think that some of those traits that I identified growing up are things that I sort of see as masculine, or kind of sort of the standards, such as just being assertive and confident, sort of stoic. I think it's traits like that that have kind of endured. Um, yeah.
Something I hear in all of that is there's some of those like sort of intrinsic states or energetic ways of embodying the masculine, which are assertive or confident. There are some internal traits that are a part of that, but then you also internalized a lot of messages about the roles you play, the look of your body, the look of your hair, the sound of your voice. um, and I think it's interesting because in many ways that exaggerated masculine archetype is still ever present, if not more present now in our
Mm.
culture. Like if you look at the trend of superheroes and the Avengers and all the different superhero movies, of these unrealistic male bodies that embody masculinity and godlikeness.
Hmm.
And I think it's interesting because for much of history, the female body has been critiqued and has been had a lot of anxiety laid over top of it. It's too thin, it's too big, it's not curvy enough. It's the skin isn't smooth enough. Like there's been a lot of sort of critique and judgment of the female form for a long time, and I do see this interesting trend also where because of the movies that are being made right now, that there's also an anxiety laid over the male body as well, and a striving for something that is often unrealistic for most of us. Is that something you
Mm.
see too?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I even think just maybe a week or two ago, I was reading something in the New York Times or somewhere. You'd have to double check this stat that I'm about to throw out, but it was something along the lines of 1 in 6 people that are diagnosed with eating disorders identify as male. And I think that's kind of interesting. And this article that I was reading was pointing to what you're speaking to, which is kind of these exaggerated sort of ideals of the male body, and that very much is can be a source of anxiety for men, even though it's kind of less highlighted in the culture.
Yeah. I think something it's interesting that you're pointing out is that how our ideals can be so easily confused with exaggerated versions of certain qualities, where in order for us to see it and for us to agree on it as a culture, it has to be exaggerated to this point of almost something that's unachievable in order for us to come to some agreement, or those social norms you were talking about that are the collection of behaviors or look or things that are fall under the umbrella of masculinity.
Mm,
I find that very interesting that an exaggerated quality is what we put as our ideals.
yeah, totally, totally. Me too. Because I do think it really sets us up for failure. I think it's interesting that we have kind of that's the way this is laid out.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of why this conversation is so important to me and why I'm doing this podcast is because I do see many of the ways in which our ideals around masculinity set us all up for failure.
Mm,
They set us up for failure in our own relationship to ourselves, in our relationship to others, and our relationship to this planet. It's not a very
mm,
sustainable way of being, the what we've put on the sort of list of highly masculine traits.
Mm.
Even as you were talking, one of the things you said was somebody that is good at, and prolific with women, basically. And
Mm.
for myself as a gay man, there's an inherent implication that I have failed as a man
Mm.
from the moment I walked into this world.
Mhm.
And I just think that's interesting that that I am a man and I very much identify as a man. And yet the current cultural constructs of masculinity have me failing from the get-go.
Mm. Mhm. Totally.
What's been your experience with that?
My experience specifically with being set up for failure.
Yeah, that and sort of being as a college student, I know that you are somebody that is interacting with a lot of young men and young women all the time. And so what is the pressure like for you in terms of those old ideals of masculinity around girls, around relationship,
Mm.
around sexuality, around the pressure and the relationship you're having with yourself?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's actually a good question for me because specifically in my generation, there's so much talk around the hookup culture, kind of in my age range, and really, so this was something I talked a bit about in one of my sociology classes that I took, and it's kind of the sort of stereotype of the college students that go out to parties and drink a lot, and then like find somebody to hook up with it at the end of the night. And I always thought, it's something. So I've never really considered myself someone that enjoys parties. I enjoy drinking alcoholic beverages from time to time, for sure, but I also don't. I've never felt super comfortable going to large parties, especially. I've never been interested in just like really going out with a bunch of like wild people um, and sort of doing that sort of stereotypical college thing. And to be clear, I'm not knocking that. I think too, though, it's more of to the extreme of like going to a frat party or kind of engaging in some of that sort of uh, culture that I have never been drawn to. Um, and so for me, I think I don't feel like I've really participated much in that kind of hookup culture. And so for me, I think constantly, especially throughout college, I've encountered feelings of just anxiety around like not sort of partaking in that because on some level, I think I feel like I'm maybe missing out or just maybe not connecting or not satisfying sort of that part of myself. And it can just be like, oh, everybody else is hooking up with everybody else, and I'm hanging out. I'm drinking tea on a Friday night at 9 p.m. And that's kind of how I've always kind of trended.
Mm,
And so I think that's definitely been a process of just starting to be okay with that and navigating some of that insecurity to a place where I'm okay with and realize that participating in that culture comes at a cost and that I actually would prefer my tea. um,
that's funny.
so,
I think that's really true for many of us as men. I know as I was saying before, as a gay man living in the gay male world, there is a lot of that hookup culture as a part of it as
mm,
well, and there's a lot of um, freedom of sexuality supposedly that's really
mm,
touted, and it never really resonated with me either. And there were many times where I felt like a failure. Like okay, well, I didn't really make it as a real man, and now as a gay man, I don't make the cut
mm,
again. And so it's really
mhm,
interesting how much pressure is on us around sexuality and engaging in sex as a
mm,
part of living up to being a man. And that if you're not prescribing to that, that you're somehow are not doing it right.
mm. Totally,
Yeah.
totally. And I think in general, just like kind of sexual adequacy or confidence is a big part of like sort of the stereotypes of manliness. Like real men are like feel super confident and adequate sexually.
Yeah.
I think in general that's sort of a broader category too that this maybe falls under.
Yeah.
And I think that's tough too. Like sex can be awkward sometimes, and that's at least for me it it has. And I think that's part of it.
Yeah, it totally is part of it. And sex can be a wonderful thing, and it can be awkward, and it can be funny, and it can be all over the place. And when there is this sort of expectation put on men that they pursue a lot of women or a lot of men or a lot of just people in general, as we start to look at how sexuality kind of lands on a spectrum, I think when you put the sort of frequency and number and that piece at the front, you actually lose the human connection quality. It no longer becomes about the person in front of you. It becomes
Mm,
about the conquest or the release of energy or the friction, for lack
mm,
of a better word.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah. So sounds to me like that belief system around masculinity no longer resonates with you. Is that true?
Mhm. Yeah.
So, what other sort of images or belief systems within masculinity are no longer resonating with you?
I think generally the belief system of kind of dominance, um, or like dominance as a behavior of manliness and as an expression of manliness is specifically one that no longer resonates with me in terms of what it means to be a man. And I think that's changed in that I feel that a new model of masculinity could incorporate um, behavior that is more receptive and more respectful, and that generally sort of aggression, violence, and dominance really just doesn't have much of a place, um, particularly as a method of like proving manliness or masculinity. It, I think it's I believe that aggression or violence is kind of part of living in this state as material beings, and that inevitably there are sometimes places for that, but that in general as a vehicle for expressing the masculine identity, I think that's a really kind of dangerous, outdated model that really doesn't fit in the world that I see today.
Yeah, I love the sort of splitting apart that you're doing in that sort of mindset, which is that yes, aggression, violence, dominance, those are all things that happen in this world. They're all a part of this world. And even in the animal kingdom, even
Hmm.
non-humans engage in aggression. They dominate each other. There's hierarchies involved in their sort of power structures of who has the most power, but that doesn't have to necessarily be associated with masculinity. Sort of the
Yeah.
untangling those things from the ideals of masculinity. That's what I hear you
Hmm.
saying.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah, I think that's really an important thing to be aware of because I think the pitfall that can be in having a conversation like this is like, okay, now we have to remove um, anger, we have to remove aggression, we have to remove self protection. We have to remove those things because that's bad in men. And it's like, it's
Mm,
not actually about that because I do think there's an innate survival mechanism in all of us that is important.
mm.
But it is about untangling it from our ideals of masculinity and asking us to be that when not necessary.
Yeah, totally.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think there are places for that stuff, and it is, biologically necessary. I also think the minute it becomes about kind of proving your identity or your status as male, um, by using dominance or aggression or violence, I think that's where um, where so many of my issues with masculinity growing up and in my history, I really dislike that kind of way of sort of solidifying one's identity.
Totally. Yeah. That's so well put that when we seek our worthiness and value as beings through those acts, that's where it becomes a problem, because now
Mm,
we're chasing something and you always need to prove something rather than just sort of knowing your worth and value as a person.
mm, mhm.
What other qualities would you say would you like to see more of in the new masculine?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, you know, it has to do with vulnerability, and being honest. For me, it roots back to being courageous, which it's funny because I do feel like courage is a trait that's already associated with masculinity, although I do feel like a lot of times sort of traditional masculine behavior sort of comes from a very fearful place, even just the behavior that we were just discussing in terms of kind of having to prove one's male identity, whether it be, through a dominance or aggression. That's a not a courageous thing to be doing. Like, to me, having courage and vulnerability are and vulnerability meaning the ability to express oneself, to be honest, to show up emotionally, to express emotion, to really just allowing, sort of a broader range of ways of being. To me, that's what this kind of new masculine thing is about. Um, and vulnerability is a key trait that is necessary for that to me.
Yeah, that feels so true to me. When you think of the word vulnerability or the concept of vulnerability, do you typically, for yourself, do you usually put that in the category of masculine or feminine?
Nowadays, I don't have it. I don't feel like it's connected to a masculine or a feminine for me nowadays. I feel like maybe, as a kid growing up, I would associate vulnerability more as like maybe a feminine trait. Um, it, but I don't know. I think the word vulnerability means something different to me now than it used to as well. I mean, at this point, vulnerability to me means just being honest, and being truthful, and kind of trusting people. And to me, it's sort of a cooperativeness. And you could even talk about the trait of cooperation as one that's traditionally seen as kind of feminine, whereas the masculine would be more kind of independent, doesn't want to work as a team. Uh, so yeah, I think at this point in my life, I see vulnerability as a trait that's disconnected from masculinity or femininity, and one that is important for both.
I'm so glad that you shared that, because I think in traditional models of masculinity, the ones that we were raised with and the ones that we've seen the most of, I do think that vulnerability is more associated with the feminine.
Mm.
How have you been able to move through that? Because it sounds like you even said for yourself that as a child, you and as a young boy, you probably thought of vulnerability more in terms of the feminine. It is a bit of a risk as a man in this culture to bring parts of things you were told were sort or that were modeled to you as feminine, to bring them into your new model of masculinity. How has that journey been for you?
Yeah, I think it's been. I think it was painful and confusing when I was going through it, and I'm still going through it. But I also feel like there was a specific time in my life where I sort of underwent a bit of a transformation in terms of moving away from more traditional models of masculinity and incorporating more traits that are traditionally seen as feminine. And I would say this kind of occurred sort of later in high school. Um, to me, the process was born out of necessity. um, it, it felt like the sort of thing where I had to, it sort of just happened. It sort of rode on the back of transition between friend groups. I was kind of in with a group of friends, and really was kind of I just sort of ended up going different directions, and really feeling like personality no longer fit. And I think it was kind of a mutual feeling. And there was this point where I had been sort of trying so hard to fit some of the more traditional models of masculinity, um, and just doing, I don't know, all sorts of things that I wouldn't consider now. I think I'd tried out for the rugby team, which, like, rugby is super cool, and not to knock rugby at all, but it's just something that nowadays, like, I laugh, like, I'm just not interested in playing rugby on a
I have a
team.
hard time seeing
Um,
you as a rugby player.
yeah. Again, like, totally respect people that love rugby, not trying to put it down at all, but it was the sort of thing where I was, um, just kind of stretching my personality in a way that wasn't comfortable. And I had been doing it for years, and it felt like, I was way off to one side, and suddenly the whole thing sort of just snapped over, and I went through this phase of kind of rebelliousness, and almost, um, kind of taking on more traditionally feminine traits in rebellion, I'd say. Like, to me, I went through this phase where I was just, like, really emotional, like, rebelliously so, really kind of just rebelling against a lot of the sort of traditional masculine ways of being, and kind of scoffing at them. It, and So to me, it was this process of, like, I was kind of launched into this integration process, is what I feel like, by sort of, for so long, kind of stretching my personality, um, into a form that didn't fit me. Um, all of that energy kind of just built up, and there was a lot of tension, and it just kind of rocketed me, in the opposite direction. And so a lot of it happened all at once. And yeah, I think it was a really, to me, it was almost easier that it happened that way. Um, I feel like, now I've come to more of a neutral point where I feel like I, um, recognize that I do really sort of represent some, and embody some of the traditionally masculine traits, but also am totally, embracing my more traditionally feminine traits as well, and feel like I'm more in the middle.
Yeah. And one of the couple of things that come up for me as you're sharing that story, as I hear that sort of rebellious adopting of the feminine, and in terms of your almost extreme emotional side. And I'm wondering, do you think that part of it was the intentional rebellion against the old ways or the old systems, but do you think that part of it was also the natural releasing of self from the box that masculinity put you in?
Yeah, totally. I think absolutely.
Because in my experience of working with other men is that as we start to really come to understand the limitations of the models that were given to us,
Mm,
there is a grief, there is a anger, there is a hurt in recognizing that we've only been given a few, like, one octave on the whole keyboard to make music from, but there are so many more octaves to play on, and there's so much
mm,
richness in adding the whole breadth of the keyboard to it.
mm, hmm. Totally. Yeah, and I think I had been emotional before. I still had kind of been bottling it in a certain sense, or just not really. There was nowhere for that sort of grief, as you put it, to go, because I was still performing the behaviors that were creating that grief. And so I do feel like as soon as I kind of snapped out of all that, there was kind of an emotional release, and kind of just a period of time where some of that stuff was kind of processing through.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I think our friendship really began maybe in that time for you, and I think that's why we connected so well, was because we both are emotional boys. And we both really just could no longer fit ourselves into the box of masculinity, traditional masculinity. We couldn't do it anymore. And so we had to push the edges.
Totally. Yeah.
So I know that you are still in college. You're about to be finished with it, but my memory of college is that there is still a bit of that still social exploration piece of finding where you fit, where you belong, that's really prominent in like a high school time frame, and
Mhm.
very developmentally sort of appropriate, but there's still elements of that in our college time frame. Do you find yourself holding back still on any of the qualities of yourself for fear of rejection or not belonging to certain social group?
Yeah, totally. So I just started at a new school this fall. So I transferred to the University of Minnesota. I've only been there for about 1 year. And I think really it's been interesting in terms of just meeting new people. Because I find that my friends that I've had around for a long time, and who really know much more of my personal history, are able to embrace more fully kind of the spectrum that of behaviors that I exhibit. But I do find that people that I'm sort of just meeting often perceive me differently than I want to be perceived. And so what I mean by that is, so as you know, basically a 6'4" male. I'm like larger. I have like a full beard, a big mane of hair. But I do think that people perceive me as like more masculine, like a I don't know. uh, it's hard for me to say, I think, but sometimes I feel like I'm being perceived as sort of a typical male, or kind of just seen as like, oh, you're just this, like, this guy. And I often find that people I'm just meeting just don't have a sense of these sides of me that aren't always seen in sort of the traditional models of masculinity. And so this would be kind of this emotional richness and depth that I've always sort of had and experienced in my life. Um, and so for me, actually, I find it gets a little bit frustrating too when people sort of don't expect me to show up in that way, or sort of write me off as a just some like meathead, or what whatever it would be. Because I, can sometimes just feel like I'm not being seen for who I feel I am. And I find it takes a little bit for people to to kind of recognize that I can embody some of these traits, and go to some of these places that people might not expect.
That's so interesting to me that people's first impressions on you of you based on the way that you look and the way that you come across, just at first glance, actually impacts your ability to bring forward the qualities that have always been quite strong in you. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, and it's hard for me to always get an accurate sense. I think some of this could just be some anxiety kind of coming through, a little bit of social anxiety, and kind of just putting thoughts in other people's heads. So I think there's a chance that some of this has to do with just a little bit of kind of insecurity, or worrying that I might not be perceived as I want to be perceived. But I really do feel like it does. A theme in my life has been, when I really get to know people, and create relationships with people, I often find that people are kind of surprised, or yeah, generally just that people don't expect sort of the sort of more emotional sides of me, that I can kind of dive to.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting conversation. I was just sharing with someone this past weekend, um, who was an African American woman, and we were talking about our experiences of being people who belong to marginalized communities. For her being
Mm,
black and experiencing racism, and for me being gay and experiencing homophobia. And I found it quite interesting because something that I have to explore and that I've been exploring in my life is I look like privilege. I am a white
Mm.
male. I am blonde. I'm blue eyed. I'm very much like the the look of what is empowered in our culture.
Mm.
Yet, that's not how I walk through the world or feel most of the time. And
Mm.
so the perception of me could, when at first glance, could be one thing, and yet my experience of the world is something very different. And being able to communicate that and share that with others is sometimes tricky and challenging. And the other piece of it is that I also have to look at the fact that the way that I look does give me a sense it does give me privilege in the world, and there are things that I
Mm.
don't worry about that maybe others have had to worry about. And
Mm.
so there is this whole conversation around sort of perception based on the way that we look versus what actually is on the inside, and how do we create enough psychological safety for ourselves to be able to put forth what comes from inside rather than allowing the external perception or what we think the perception is about us to be the real storyline.
Mm. Hmm.
So I think what you're talking about is a really important piece of this is to acknowledge that as men, we do have a sense of privilege and we do have power just based on the way we look. It
Mm.
doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily have to do with who we are inside.
Mm.
And I think it is important for us to be aware of that so that we can consistently check that, but
Mm.
then also to bring forward the real person that's in there.
Yeah, no, I think so. And to me, this in this vein, I think it's, you know, I do, always remember it's like I am the face of privilege, I think as a again as a white straight male, it's like I forget, but I think regardless of how I feel on the inside or whatever, what my experience is, that people might be primed to sort of be afraid of me or associate sort of negative experiences with people that look male. And so for me, I totally recognize that and see that I have to be sensitive. And I think I think it comes from a place for me of just being bummed that people have that experience and hoping that men can provide safer experiences for all other people.
Yeah, and I know something that's important in your life, at least at this phase of your life, is that you teach children. Can you
Yeah.
share a little bit about that? About how you create safe space for children, how you allow them the space to explore, how you model sort of your values around masculinity at this point?
That's a good question, and that's been something I've been thinking a bit about lately. So yeah, so I teach at a sailing school over at the Lake Minnetonka Sailing School. To me, with kids, I think in terms of creating a safe space, so it almost comes back to what I was saying before. It's like I can often be perceived as this big sort of male figure, and I think sometimes we'll get a new group of kids in and they kind of look up at me and I'm like this big guy with this big beard. And to me, like, creating a safe space with my kids is sort of done via comedy. Like for me, just kind of joking around and being goofy. Like really, I have a quite a goofy streak that that I like to exercise around my kids, and to me that helps create a safe space. Um, and I think in terms of sort of modeling masculinity, I do see oftentimes, I don't know, it's tough. It's like a lot of it will come in and we'll have a group of kids, and there's such a broad array of different personalities oftentimes and behaviors, but you'll oftentimes see sort of the archetypical kind of dude in the sitting in the back who doesn't want to cooperate and who is kind of a troublemaker and is funny but is kind of steering the class in the in a different direction than I want to take it. and is just kind of a knucklehead sometimes. And I think, that's great. But I also think that some of that behavior specifically can come from sort of our cultural templates. But to me, in terms of modeling, I think I'm modeling, a style of leadership for my kids that isn't super authoritative. I think it's hard. Sometimes in terms of classroom management, you do have to be kind of just. I find that I sometimes just have to lay down the law and say, "Hey, this is how it's going to be." But I think again, it's like steering away from just dominance, and just kind of forcing people to do things. Um, and, and that's easy. So in a classroom setting, I think just kind of laying down laws and being really strict is kind of an easy sort of out. What's more difficult, I find, but also more rewarding, is to actually win the respect of your students, eh, and sort of, it comes from a sort of a charisma. It takes a little bit more sort of effort, in terms of being charismatic, and that if you can kind of be friends with your kids and develop some rapport in that way, that oftentimes is the style of leadership that I and masculinity in general that I'd like to demonstrate rather than sort of the strict dominance.
Yeah, it sounds like to me you see the value both of the boundary around what's not working, but also the incentivizing of what is working and
Mm,
rewarding and bringing forward traits that you really want to celebrate and bring out in the kids, while also
mm,
being willing to have a boundary on what's not working.
mhm. Totally.
That's something that I've learned in my work with horses. When engaging with an animal that doesn't speak the same language as you do and you're trying to communicate a message, pressure and the release of pressure, or sort of the putting a boundary on what's not working or what's not safe, or um, the behavior you'd like to curb, is important.
Mm,
But even more important sometimes is the release of pressure, is the rewarding for what is going well, so that the relationship and the cooperation starts to build, rather than that sort of top down hierarchical, I have all the power, you have none of the power, and now I'm dominating you kind of thing.
that's interesting. No, and I think I'm sure in your studies of psychology, talking about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. I mean, I know, so I took a class called Learning and Behavior this spring, and I thought one of the most interesting takeaways from this class was basically that oftentimes punishment, which is a form of negative reinforcement, oftentimes is sort of relied on too much, and that it oftentimes is ineffective. And that, so basically, what was discussed is that punishment is really good at basically stopping a specific behavior, but it is not good at showing people or just organisms in general what to do or what behavior should be done. And so really it's like punishment alone, dominance alone, the hierarchy kind of sort of mindset, that alone doesn't show people what to do. It sort of just is kind of looping them and telling them what not to do.
And
Mm,
that relates so much to what I want to be doing in this conversation and in my conversations with other men, is that there are a lot of conversations out there about what's not working with masculinity, toxic masculinity, and tearing down the patriarch. And the anger that's present in those conversations is right and due, and I would never try to shift it or make it go away. The accountability piece is really important in our culture right now.
mm,
And yet, I find many of us don't know where to go then.
mm,
Once we see the problem, and I think there are a lot of men that are waking up to the problems and really
mm,
starting to become aware that our ways of being are not sustainable, kind, empathetic, nurturing. They're not doing well by ourselves, by each other, or for this planet. And yet, many of us don't have models for where to where to look to do better. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what I want to do with this conversation, is really create some positive feedback loops and support each other and to build each other up and to acknowledge, yeah, I think you've got a piece of what I'm trying to learn for myself, and I really want to use you or pieces of you as a model for that.
Mm,
And I so appreciate you bringing that forward, because it's not just in teaching roles with children that we can utilize those skill sets. We can actually use those in our interactions with each other. And I really want us as men, and those of us that really are already sort of waking up to this, I really want us to support each other in stepping forward, and as a community, grow each other up a little bit.
mm. Totally. I really like that you're saying that and that you've connected this back to the kind of masculinity topic in general. I think I totally see the same thing amongst some people where um, they know what's bad, but they don't necessarily know where to go or what's good. And I think I really like that a model can be provided, or a little bit of direction is provided for people.
Yeah, and I think we do that for each other. I don't necessarily consider myself the full expert in knowing where this is going, but I think we
Mm,
all hold pieces of it. And if we gather in community and do the risky thing that our culture doesn't teach us to do, which is to be vulnerable with each other as men and to
mm,
share intimacy. And I don't mean sexuality when I say
mm,
intimacy, but care and nurturing and sharing where we're afraid, where we're vulnerable, where we failed. That can really help each other grow up and to
mm.
evolve into the next iteration of ourselves as men.
Cool.
Do
Heck yeah.
you do you see any sort of models of what you would call new masculine behavior out there in the world? Do you see anybody out there that inspires you?
It's I don't know. So this question is one that's tricky for me. I I don't feel like I've seen a lot of men out there who I'm like, wow, you really embody this whole movement for me. This is the kind of man that I want. And obviously, I think models of the new masculine and just in general masculinity is something that's the sort of more decided on an individual basis, or that's kind of what I've experienced, at least, is that I kind of want to write my own story, and there's no exact blueprint that I want to just copy. And just understanding that we all are very different, and that we all will kind of have some variation. Um, but so people that I feel are sort of embodying new models in some way um, would be just some of the artists that I look up to. I remember when I was actually in high school, there was this spoken word artist who came to our high school. Um, and he, I don't remember the exact lines from his spoken word piece that he did, but he was doing some really cool stuff. It was, so I think his piece was it was titled along the lines of 10 responses you can give when someone tells you to man up. Uh,
Oh,
and,
that
and
phrase is
I,
used way too much in our
yeah,
culture.
uh-huh, uh-huh. And so he had basically come up with 10 responses, and they were, I don't remember exactly what they were, but so the first one was "fuck you," um, and so to me, that sort of, I don't know, defiance of the phrase "man up," which so often has been used to for, mostly for men to control other men, is what it seems like to me, or just people to control men. I think that's a phrase that can be used. Really, anyone can use that, and it's been a way to sort of shape male behavior and show people what they should be doing. And to me, that that first response, "fuck you," is like um, just defiantly shaking off um, that kind of box. Like, we're not gonna behave in this traditionally masculine way. Fuck you.
Oh, I love that, because you're so right that it is actually a piece of control that our culture uses on us and that we use on each other. That if you're not acting in a way that I'm comfortable with, I'm going to tell you to man up. And
Mm-hmm.
I think I think even just the anger that's associated with that phrase of fuck off or fuck no or however you say it is
Uh-huh.
is actually appropriate in that situation. It is that anger fuels sort of casting off that box and of control that's placed on us and saying,
Mm.
"No, I'm gonna define this for myself." And I love that you were talking about that you I mean, you're first acknowledging that there aren't that many models, visible for many of us of what
Mm-hmm.
somebody embodying the new masculine would be, and I think that's an important point, but I think the way that you're making sense of and making meaning around it is that that's the opportunity for you to create your own blueprint, and I love that because
Mm.
I don't wanna create a new box to put people in.
Mm-hmm.
I wanna help people find what's authentic and real and truthful for them and help guide some of the things that aren't working into a more sustainable and working place. So I really enjoy how you put that around creating your own blueprint of what it means to be a man in this world.
I'm glad. Yeah. No, I like how you put that too. Of I think there are some general kind of characteristics that we can all, or that it seems like some people agree, are we can shift in terms of masculinity, but there's also it's also much looser and much more individual. I like that you said that we're not trying to control anybody.
Yeah. And I don't think it's helpful to create another exaggerated ideal in a different direction that then people use
Mm,
against themselves as a place of failure again. And
yeah.
so being able to create your own reality around this is, I think, the way to go. And listening to the experiences of others and the impact we have on others in our behavior is the way that we start to find what is not only authentic to our own expression, but also cooperative, vulnerable, honest, courageous, that's belonging to something.
Mm, hmm.
So, I guess the way I would like to end this conversation is to ask you, do you have one piece of advice you'd like to give to men?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I don't know. I don't love giving advice, but I would say to me, advice surrounding sort of this line of conversation is just that for people that are struggling, that are kind of stuck in the sort of traditional models of masculinity and feel like something is missing there, and who, as you said, may be experiencing depression, anxiety, or anger as a result. For me, the advice is just to to be brave enough to look beyond what people told you had to be, and to search for kind of ways of being that really do fit you and allow you to express who you are. Because I think all the men I know are so much larger and embody so many more traits than cultural stereotypes allow them to. And for me, I think just the freedom of experience that I've been able to gain by shedding some of these more traditional models, I couldn't imagine where I would be without having made that transition. To me, my existence was so kind of narrow and shallow prior to. Yeah, I can't picture where I would be. I think I would be so disconnected from myself. To me, the best thing is really to allow this broad range of traits that we are kind of intrinsically capable of embodying. And I think we all can just live such more fulfilling experiences if we can kind of go beyond these traditional models.
That's such powerful advice and words and encouragement that you're giving. And it resonates true with my own experience of the world, that I was the most depressed and the most struggling and the most angry when I was trying to fit myself into a box and
Mm,
into this masculinity thing. And what I would extrapolate from what you're saying and how the language that I would use on it is to start questioning, is it actually something wrong with you, or is it something wrong with the system that you're trying to
mm,
engage with? Because in many ways, my life has only become more rich as I cast off that and allowed myself, as you were saying, the freedom to explore the rich range of behaviors and feelings and ways of expressing myself.
mhm.
And I think that's really powerful advice that you're giving, is to be brave enough to question the system and to step outside of it. Sounds like you have experienced this, I've experienced it, and I've watched many of my clients as they cast off the system and the box that masculinity puts on them and allow themselves to explore something more authentic to who they are. The well-being and the wholeness sense and the belonging only increases from there.
Totally, and I think it's important to know that, it feels scary, but a lot of it to me too is just kind of the immediate social circles that surround us oftentimes are kind of what keep us in that or can encourage us to branch out. And to me, uh, I don't know, I feel like kind of transitioning between social circles and surrounding myself with people that supported me in being whatever I wanted to be is what allowed me to make that switch. And I think for people struggling with that, it's like, find people that allow you to inhabit that space. Find people that like you and celebrate you for that. And that makes it so much easier. And I think just knowing too that the masculinity police aren't going to come for you when you when you make this switch. It's I think it feels scary, and it feels like you'll be outed, or it's you won't.
Yeah.
I think it's less of a big deal than it might seem, is my experience.
That's so well said. And I love that you're talking about this piece of community that helps support that. And I think that's so important. And it's why I want to talk to men like you, is because even in my own journey, I want to be surrounded by men who celebrate that and that who encourage me. And I think that's the way to do it. That's the way to keep going. So if
Mm.
people were interested in connecting with you further, I know you're an artist, you were talking about your music and your photography earlier. If people want to connect with you and see your work and engage in community with you, how might they do that?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a couple projects right now. So for a while, I was off of Instagram, but I've actually created an Instagram account. Currently, it's set to private, but I think I'll be making sort of a designated photography Instagram account for myself as I sort of pursue that more seriously. But the name of my account is
Since recording this episode, Alec has decided to follow through with his desire to create a photography Instagram. His new Instagram handle is alexander.mckee.photo. ALEXANDER.MCKEE.photo.
feel free to look me up on Facebook too. My name is just Alec Mckee. I think anybody that's listening to this podcast, I'd love to be friends with and kind of join in community with. Yeah, I'm hoping to put out some music here pretty soon. So I haven't really released any music for a couple years, but I've got some stuff brewing. I've got a fairly dense catalog of songs that have kind of built up over the last couple of years, and I'm hoping to release them in some form.
If people want to connect with me, you can connect with me on my Instagram also. It's both personal life and my coaching work. It's at Travers03, so TRAVERS 03. Or you can check me out on my website at travisstock.com. you're interested in coaching or talking about this, that's where you can reach me. I do lots of different forms of coaching. So if you're interested in connecting and want to explore potentially working together, that's the place to get me. You can also just email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com. Thank you, Alec, for joining me on the podcast. I so appreciate this conversation. I think you brought up some really great points and spoke so beautifully about what you see. I think the importance of bringing in the feminine into the masculine space is such an important journey that most of us are on as men. And I love that you, as a young white straight man, can own that and not be afraid of what it means about you or what other people are going to say. And as you said, the masculinity police didn't come after you and lock you up.
I'm on the run.
Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.